Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 3 of Series 11. The question for today is, does Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, flout Hume's is-ought distinction? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 3. So this Series 10 is about analysing the main theories of ethics, and last week I gave a critique of ethics in general. And these critiques lead to my own provisional value theory ethics. It is provisional because all theories of ethics have limitations as one of the many expressions of value. Other expressions of value are meaning, purpose, romance, religion, and aesthetics. So I propose a more general human objective in the form of the will to value, leading to a certain independence or sufficiency of value. Yet as ethics is a major expression of value, we are analysing ethics in order to work towards that objective. And paradoxically, although I believe that there has been ethical development over the history of mankind, I will be starting with the most recent theories that unexpectedly appear to be the least viable. So we can begin this inverted hierarchy with Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape. But I'm not alone in this criticism, and some of the many critics of Harris's book include John Horgan, Nathan Robinson, Thomas Nagel, Troy Jollimore, Anthony Appiah, and Russell Blackford. And Colin McGinn also writes that there's just some really bad thinking in Sam Harris's new book. It sounds terrible and wrong-headed and just bizarre. He's trying to make science do what religion used to. The idea is wrong, it's been refuted. It's hard to believe they still argue that point, unquote. Among the many mistakes that Harris makes in his book, two of them are also revealed by classical arguments. Firstly, Harris's claim that science can determine human or ethical values contravenes Hume's law of the is-ought distinction, that moral values cannot be legitimately derived from facts. Secondly, Harris's use of well-being or happiness and suffering as criteria of ethical events ignores G.E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy of confusing natural states like desirable and pleasant with what is the moral good. We will discuss these arguments again later. Yet even before examining these arguments, we must ask, why should we analyse Harris's book if it is so flawed? Firstly, it shows how intelligent people can be very mistaken if they aren't informed or well-intentioned, and that being informed by crucial ideas can be compensated by sheer intelligence. This is evident in the errors made by geniuses like Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, and Newton. Secondly, this book provides an opportunity to discuss rationality, cognition, and science in philosophy and ethics. That is, despite Hume's law and McGinn's disbelief, there is still great confusion about these relations. And thirdly, such confusion illustrates a widespread neglect of the idea or concept of value that is a key impediment to my central concern about the will to value, leading to a sufficiency of value that I argue elsewhere at length. Perhaps these criticisms of Harris are misplaced. He might only be presenting a practical guide to human improvement and the good life. Or he might be trying to replace ethics with another means of calibrating human action. But his title, The Moral Landscape, and his many claims within the book say otherwise. Yet we should begin an analysis with a brief summary of Harris's book in 3 points. 1. Morality is all about improving the well-being of conscious creatures. 2. Facts about the well-being of conscious creatures are accessible to science. And 3. Therefore, science can tell us what objectively moral as an increase or decrease is well-being. The most egregious of these claims is that morality is all about improving the well-being of conscious creatures. We will examine this and other claims shortly. Yet we should note that Harris emphasizes consciousness and the well-being of conscious creatures. This is consistent with outcomes in terms of states like well-being or the worst possible misery, rather than adhering to religious injunctions or abstract principles. But he doesn't hold that consciousness is the ground and basis of values, as I contend. Instead, underpinning Harris's argument is his contentious claim that science can determine human values. This is a hugely controversial idea and would have to overcome many problems such as Hume's is-ought distinction and Mackie's rejection of objective values, as well as many other problems like moral conflict, human relations and human choice. Yet one question is about what Harris's claim means. Does it mean that science can answer and determine ethical questions rather than inform them? If he's saying science can inform ethical questions, then not many of us would disagree. For example, science can tell us whether smoking is harmful, and that bears upon whether we should encourage smoking. But it doesn't determine whether we should encourage smoking or not. It is important to distinguish here the material content of action from the formal content of a principle of intent. This is because the good or bad intentions of an agent are a large part of what morality consists of. But astonishingly, Harris has practically nothing to say about intentions and other moral states. He only focuses on human outcomes in terms of well-being, happiness, pain and suffering. Yet this is also true of utilitarianism, which is also criticised for the same reason. Harris also insists that only science can help us answer the questions of meaning, morality and life's larger purpose, unquote. And he goes on to present his view as a bold new claim of determining human values with science. But it's far from being a new claim, and its boldness seems to stem from naivety, as we will see. And many others have attempted and failed to make similar arguments from science. For example, in the 70s, the sociobiologist Edward O. Wilson claimed that science may soon be in a position to investigate the very origin and meaning of human values, unquote. But Wilson has since admitted to not being able to show the obligatory force of these values beyond their social or psychological consequences. And Harris is faced with the same problem of establishing human or moral values. But in order to bolster his position, Harris makes a startling claim against the fact value and is-ought distinctions. He says that the separation between science and human values is an illusion, unquote. For Harris, this follows from his definition of good as well-being that can be determined by science. And he defines bad as the worst possible misery for everyone as a factual state that is indisputably bad. But this fails to differentiate moral good or bad from other kinds of good or bad. Yet for Harris, because science can facilitate well-being and mitigate misery, science and moral values are so closely linked as to make them inseparable. That is, science can supposedly determine values by identifying the ways in which values flow from the objectively good or bad experiences of conscious creatures. We will address the idea of objectively good or bad experiences later. But we must first address Harris's issue with the fact-value distinction presented more forcefully by Hume's law. The fact-value distinction isn't the same as the more powerful is-ought distinction because of its moral implications. Yet to appreciate Harris's case, we should first consider some of the ways that science can and cannot determine human and moral values. One way that science might determine values is by offering attractive options that people choose to value. And those attractive options would incur certain values as people begin to follow them. But this process does not provide moral imperatives that always motivate people to action. Another way that science might determine values is by revealing the social and biological forces that act upon people. But social and biological forces are subject to the naturalistic fallacy and don't carry moral compulsion. And as Harris doesn't discuss the naturalistic fallacy, he is in no position to resist it. Yet another way that science might determine values is by showing the value-laden nature of science. That is, as Hilary Putnam argued, facts and values cannot be completely disentangled. Or in another way, Thomas Kuhn has shown science to be subject to social influence. Or the practice of science involves choices, preference and values about what to focus on. But yet again, value-ladenness does not provide either moral or motivational values. Still another philosophical rather than scientific argument is that consciousness brings values into the world. But much needs to be explained before these can be translated into moral values. And this is nothing like the kind of argument that Harris is making. These are four different ways in which science might determine or bring values into the world. But none of them provide moral or overwhelming motivational values. Yet considering them shows possible mistakes and difficulties of obtaining values from science. Yet another source of values is values produced by pain, pleasure and the need of survival. These are the kinds of values that Harris is appealing to, and we will consider such shortly. Yet we first need to consider the general principles of Hume and More that Harris doesn't consider. To repeat, as earlier, Harris claims that scientific methods and facts can determine human and moral values. But against this view stands Hume's law, and also in Harris's argument, More's naturalistic fallacy. Hume's law is again that a prescriptive ought cannot be deduced from a factual is, or that moral values cannot be derived from reason, also called the is-ought distinction. More's naturalistic fallacy poses another problem for the derivation of moral values, that is, confusing moral values with natural psychological states, nature or the non-conscious world. And More claimed that such oversight could be found in practically every ethical theory. So unsurprisingly, like much of science, Harris ignores the problem. Other scientists who ignore the problem are the noted Edward O. Wilson, Michael Shermer, Lawrence Krauss and Stephen Hawking. But with respect to Hume's law, this principle has never been unseated. This is despite continuous challenges by such as Iris Murdoch, A.N. Pryor and John Searle. And Hume's law has thought to be proven by More's naturalistic fallacy. Examples of both Hume's and More's principles can be taken from human life. For example, the fact that men have always been the dominant gender doesn't mean that they ought to be taken as such. Or the fact that gay people can't reproduce naturally doesn't mean that they ought not to adopt children. Blackford concurs that Harris is no more successful in deriving ought from is than anyone else has been. And Blackford adds that the whole intellectual system of the moral landscape depends upon an ought being built into its foundations. In a later essay, Harris replies that the same can be said about medicine and science as a whole, unquote. But his answer is wholly inadequate and reveals the basic flaw in Harris's thinking. This is because medicine and science presuppose the accepted values of health and knowledge, but the principles and desired outcomes of ethics aren't empirically obvious facts. These differences are enforced by Hume's law, for which I can briefly outline 5 supporting arguments. One argument supporting Hume is that he finds a previously unrecognised relation that has to be accounted for. In his 1740 treatise, Hume writes that in every system of morality that I have hitherto met with, I am surprised to find that instead of is and is not, I meet with an ought or an ought not. Unquote. That is, a moral value is being surreptitiously smuggled into the equation by sleight of hand. 2. Another argument for the is-ought constraint can be taken from the tautologous character of logic. Nothing can be in a conclusion that isn't contained within its premises, neither properties or values. For example, given 10 rooms with 10 chairs in each room, therefore we have 100 chairs, not 100 red chairs or 100 valued chairs in all the rooms. 3. An argument from reason and reasonableness is that we can appeal to moral intuition to override dogma. That is, dictates of logic, universalization, or nature should not override human judgment. For example, human judgment should override natural law, like survival of the fittest. 4. Belief in freedom and choice means that I can assert my own values over dictates and injunctions. This isn't incoherent, but relegating the significance of logical consequences, God's will or genetics. For example, if I do X, I will go to hell, but I'd rather go to hell in freedom than be a slave in heaven. And 5. Finally, morals are expressions of value, whereas facts are aspects of cognition, and the two shouldn't be confused. Justification of this distinction also derives from my 4-state typology of cognition, affect, will and value. And More's revelation of confusion can similarly be seen as one between affect and value. The outcome is that scientific facts about other states, such as well-being or the worst possible misery, cannot in themselves determine moral values, which require a further value judgment in order to render them moral, however intuitively or existentially compelling they may be. Such seems to be the case with Harris's advocacy of well-being that we can now examine more closely. One common criticism of this well-being is how do we scale, measure and define it. Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have researched this problem of well-being, but Harris fails to mention either. Yet the problems of measuring and quantifying well-being are also common to utilitarianism, but in these respects utilitarian happiness may be less problematic than that of well-being. This is because it may be more obvious to determine actions that lead to happiness than to well-being. That is, as well-being can't be defined in detail, it can't give detailed ethical guidance. This raises further problems that stem from those of definition and vagueness. We will discuss these shortly. Yet in reply to the problems of definition, vagueness and the measurement of well-being, Harris makes a comparison. That is, he likens well-being to health, and like health, well-being also resists precise definition. Now, we must admit that resistance to definition does not invalidate the idea of health or the idea of well-being. But in the case of well-being, the broad definition of well-being hides errors that can't be hidden in health. That is, health primarily deals with empirical and pragmatic issues that are in principle open to view. But well-being is an ethical construct which involves many debatable issues. This seems to be exactly what Harris seeks to avoid in recourse to science. And another crucial issue that arises with respect to well-being is the question, what is it? Apart from its unproven connotations of ease and integration, it is only another word for the good. And although Harris assumes that it is obvious, defining the good is a central moral question. So much so that Moore argued that the good cannot be defined. Yet I do define it in terms of value reflected back onto the agent. And Aristotle entreats us to discover what is the good so that we might direct our lives towards it. So Harris appears guilty of a tautology in replacing the word good with well-being, as in the good is good. And Wittgenstein similarly warns us not to be bewitched by language, by thinking that if we have a word for something like well-being, we understand what it is. The limitations of this idea of well-being come to light when we point out what is required of the concept of good. And these requirements outlined below also revealed what is crucially lacking in Harris's ethics. Much of what is lacking in Harris's ethics is evident in its ability to articulate ethical dilemmas. For example, why we should value other people, and to what extent should I value other people's values over my own? And should we value other people equally as ourselves, or more or less than ourselves? Other ethical dilemmas evoke moral states like guilt, conscience, moral fortitude, selfishness, and magnanimity. We also need to assess and compare states like happiness, moral integrity, hope, loyalty, and pragmatism. And on a broader view of ethics, we can ask about meaning, purpose, and how am I to live? And a comprehensive theory of ethics also needs an explanation or theory of motivation. But Harris's ethics doesn't explain any of these things. He responds to such issues as motivation by advocating a rational understanding of human well-being. Immanuel Kant presents one of the most elaborate attempts to establish a rational understanding of ethics. But Harris neither discusses Kant nor the problems that Kant faced in this endeavour. That is, rationality alone provides neither an adequate theory nor ethical motivation. Yet on Harris's rationalist and supposedly self-evident ethics, everything that increases well-being is good, and everything that moves away from misery, or the worst possible misery, is bad. But as we are seeing, both well-being and worse misery are woefully inadequate as moral criteria. But Harris nevertheless claims that to say that an act is morally necessary or evil or blameless is to make tacit claims about consequences in the lives of conscious creatures, either actual or potential. I am unaware of any interesting exceptions to this rule, unquote. But the reverse that he needs isn't true, that consequences have necessary moral implications for people's lives, unless, that is, we accept utilitarianism without argument and without arguments against it. Yet we need to say that Harris's ethic of well-being shares many of the problems of other theories of ethics. Modern theories of ethics also largely focus on limited questions of what is moral and how must I act. Yet in classical theories, ethics needs to cover a lot more things within human experience, like meaning, purpose, intention, aesthetic experience, belief, hope, doubt and anxiety, or as in Aristotelian ethics, the good life and human flourishing. And a really adequate account of why we should value other people isn't found in any current theory of ethics. We might, for example, accept that other people have intrinsic value, but we still have to find some reason to accept their intrinsic value into our own value system. Harris doesn't seem to appreciate or consider this problem. Yet as part of this critique, I should reiterate my own value theory ethics. On this view, morality is a means of reflecting value back onto the agent, either elevating or depressing his value depending on the particular ethical judgment made. And other people are part of this inescapable but not necessary process of self-valuation. Further clarification of ethics and its components can be found in my typology of cognition, affect, will and value. And morality is a particular kind of value state different to that of meaning, purpose and aesthetics. Yet we need to account for the fact that Harris has set up his moral parameters of good and bad as the worst possible misery for everyone, as well as the good in the form of well-being. And Harris posits the worst possible misery for everyone as a factual state that is indisputably bad. And again, in his view, everything that moves towards such misery is bad. But a basic and repeated problem here is that well-being and misery, as good and bad, need not be moral problems. They could be medical, psychological, social, political or economic problems rather than moral problems. And that these are considered moral or as moral activities depends upon a moral judgment. This is a further difficulty for equating scientific facts with moral values. And several commentators have noted just this, that Harris has an idiosyncratic way of establishing moral facts, that is, of establishing moral facts that directly from conscious experiences like happiness and suffering without subjecting them to intervening moral assessment. This view might be intuitively compelling in such cases as acute pain, but it is nevertheless philosophically naive and illegitimate. Yet there are other problems with the worst possible misery for everyone as indisputably or inescapably bad. One is that it may not be indisputably or inescapably bad. There may be other things that are worse, such as betraying my friends, denying the truth, being intentionally immoral, not doing God's will, etc., etc. Therefore, the worst possible misery for everyone doesn't do what it is supposed to do. That is, it doesn't act as an ultimate moral backstop that delimits the concept of ethics. Secondly, the worst misery isn't a moral backstop because it isn't inherently a moral principle. That is, it omits the possibility of being subject to moral choice. For example, I may choose to endure Harris's misery in order to prevent someone else having to endure it. Harris seems to completely ignore this essentially moral aspect of morality. He does this because he tends to adopt a physicalist conception of misery because of physical circumstances. And he claims that there is no perspective that can avoid the fact that pain is bad or undesirable. For example, Harris talks about the pain of one's hand being burnt on a hot stove as unavoidably bad. And he says there is no position from where it could be considered good. But the badness of physical pain must be distinguished from the morally bad. Yet Thomas Nagel also makes a similar point about pain being a clear case of something objectively bad. But athletes, heroes, Nietzscheans, moralists and Christian redemptionists would disagree. Yet we must say more about the moral significance of misery and pain shortly. Thirdly, the worst misery may well be bad, but the idea of bad is already contained in the idea of worst misery. Harris could also say that the worst is bad, or bad is bad, which is another empty tautology. For example, we could say stealing is wrong, but the idea of wrongness is already contained in the idea of stealing, reframing the idea as taking things that do not belong to you produces different results. Fourthly, Harris wants the worst misery to mean as bad as it's possible to be, but the definition of worst misery as the worst possible bad is already a philosophical problem. This is because the idea of indisputably or inescapably bad sets a standard that cannot be disproven. That is, the indisputably or inescapably bad already discounts any possible exceptions, and as Popper and others hold, the unprovable is neither philosophy or science. And fifthly, Harris not only flouts Hume's principle by deriving moral values from scientific facts, but he also ignores More's naturalistic fallacy with his notions of well-being and worst possible misery. That is, More's fallacy is to confuse the moral good with natural states like pleasant and desirable, and Harris's misery or pain is plainly confused with the moral good or bad. That is, as noted earlier, the word good can of course be used in both moral and non-moral ways. We can say that this is a good car, or that happiness is good and pain is bad. But these meanings are not the same as the moral good or bad that Harris overlooks. More's naturalistic fallacy can also be supported by my typology of cognition, affect, will and value. That is, cognitive facts, affect states and values are different kinds of phenomena. Events in one realm may affect the other, but necessary relations can't be drawn between them. So the desirable and the pleasant, or pain and suffering, don't necessarily imply moral values. Yet Harris's attempt to equate moral values with facts has problems that go beyond those of Hume and More. There is a tradition of moral facts and ethical realism rejected by many, such as Bernard Williams. John Mackey's error theory also argues against objective values that Harris implies. That is, the view that science determines moral values implies objective values in the world. In response, Harris accuses Mackey of conflating the two notions of objectivity and subjectivity. But Mackey makes no such error in his basic terms of reference. Mackey's point is that there are no objective values as ontological entities in the fabric of the world. Mackey isn't talking here about universal values or their prescriptive power. I've also argued that a neglect of value leads to a neglect and a misunderstanding of principles of ethics. I've shown above that such a misunderstanding is evident in Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape. But the moral landscape reveals a neglect of both value and basic principles of ethics. That is, a book with such a title must include its major features that Harris leaves out. It doesn't refer to the work of Aristotle, Kant or Hume, but only looks to science. But many thinkers agree with Harris's rejection of moral relativity, yet they think he does so for the wrong reasons. These are compelling intuitions of injustice, unacceptable outcomes, and moral facts derived from science. He nevertheless convincingly states that the most basic facts about human flourishing must transcend culture, and that, for example, the beliefs of the Taliban are incompatible with human flourishing. That is, they encourage suicide bombing, compulsory veiling and genital mutilation, as well as denying women education and punishing people with beatings, acid or death. Blackford states that Harris reaches the conclusions about moral relativism only by offering what strikes me as highly implausible and ultimately unsustainable account of phenomenon of morality, unquote. Blackford goes on to explain that the problem lies in his insistence that moral judgments are straightforwardly and determinately true or false in the same way as factual statements. Yet Harris does rightly emphasise the dangers of defending detrimental cultural practices. We can find examples in slavery, the castration of eunuchs, and punishment by amputation. But imposing moral values on past and distant cultures is a difficult undertaking. Isaiah Berlin holds, for example, that we can't morally judge other cultures of different times. And he writes that there can exist no superstandard for the comparison of entire scales of value, which itself derives from no specific set of beliefs, no one specific culture, unquote. Examples of such are found in the New Testament, where Paul exhorts slaves, be obedient to your human masters, Ephesians 6:5, Colossians 3:22 and 1 Timothy 6:1. And Harris also unfairly contrasts moral relativism with moral realism as the only way forward. As indicated here, moral realism is a contentious position rejected by Mackey, Williams and many others. Moral facts, value realism and an ethics derived from science is only one option. There are many ways of countering moral relativity apart from moral realism. I have presented some of these in my workshops. So we can conclude by not only rejecting Harris's ethic of well-being, but also the thinking it stands on. That is, the view that science or scientific facts can determine human or moral values. Yet more than that, Harris' book shows how intelligent people can be mistaken if they aren't properly informed. And for Harris, this includes a neglect of Hume's law and More's fallacy, as well as a neglect of value. He flouts Hume's law by attempting to derive prescriptive moral oughts from scientific facts, and he is guilty of More's naturalistic fallacy by confusing the natural states of well-being and the worst misery with the moral good and value states. And both his criteria of well-being and worst misery are so general as to lack meaning and specific guidance. It fails, for example, to resolve ethical dilemmas such as relations with others and duties to the well-being of others. It also leaves out meaning and purpose, as well as doubt, anxiety, conscience and other moral states. We can also add Aristotelian ethics, character and the good life of human flourishing. Yet, like some other theories, Harris doesn't offer an adequate explanation of why we should value other people. But Harris is culpable because he doesn't even consider the question of why we should value other people. And even his critique of moral relativity is grounded on the assumption of values derived from science. And it is further assumed that those values can simply be adopted on a rationalist basis. Have we been too harsh on Harris for errors in his bold new claim that science can determine human values? Scholars like Horgan, Robinson, Nagel, Jollimore, Appiah, McGinn and Blackford don't think so. Yet we should be grateful to Harris for underlining the problem of establishing a moral imperative. Such has not been established by religion, reason, psychology, biology, sociology or science. And I have said many times that I myself begin not with these disciplines but with value itself. That is, choosing value is a valid and better alternative than cognition, affect or volition. And that value is a constituent of consciousness that comes into existence with consciousness, and as such it is subject to constraints and conditions that we could call moral. So the failure of Harris's ethics moves us closer to the only legitimate basis for an ethics or a philosophy of life. That basis is the subjectivity of consciousness that Harris uses as a source of desirable and undesirable states, but fails to employ as the basis and ground of value which impels and can direct human action. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom, meetup.com and YouTube.